vicious is because the international trade negotiations hijack the African intra-trade agenda. We discuss trade facilitation more in terms of give and take with partners of Africa, rather than the need for facilitation in Africa itself for regional integration. And therefore, you have a situation that is developing in Africa that is quite interesting. Most of the integration is taking place above the head of the state and under its belly, as I like to say. Above the state, because if you look into the financial integration that is taking place with banks that are becoming Pan-African, just take the example of EcoBank with 33 African countries coverage, or roaming mobile facilities that integrate completely groups of countries. You have not even the roaming concept that you have in other parts of the world, because people don't pay any fee from using the same phone in 13 countries. This is above the state. And under the belly, because of the private movements of goods and services that don't go through the border post. We have an informal sector that is responsible for most of the integration in Africa. It's calculated at about 40%. And this is what really governments have to realize, that the regulatory frameworks that are required in the continent right now have to take into account activity that is really going way beyond the concepts of regional integration that we have discussed so far. And I'll finish just with the last point, because we talk about investments in Africa. They are growing exponentially. By 2020, they will be at the level of China. And we realize that this is mostly associated with two untruths. The first untruth is that it is related to natural resources. Only part, and a very small part, is related to natural resources. Most of FDI to Africa is not going to natural resources. And the second untruth is to think that most of it is actually coming from certain types of countries and realities. And obviously the example that people throw all the time is China. Well, about China, I have to say just one thing. I wish they could do much more, because all their investment in Africa is less than 4% of the Chinese investment in the world. So it's very little what they are doing in Africa. It's so residual that it can be associated as risk capital. And finally, I would say that people forget that the number one investor in Africa is from Africa, South Africa.
Thank you. President Kaberuka, I will ask you, just after asking Angel Gurria to maybe comment of what Carlos Sope said, especially about China. Angel Gurria, how has the role of OECD evolved in Africa? And the second question also to you is, I know that you have been actively promoting better taxation. So what are the implications for the African countries?
One of the organizers of this meeting is the Development Center, which has a large number of African members, full members, that interact with the members of the OECD in a rather, I would say, seamless fashion. Because now the development strategy of the OECD is precisely not to have a separate development initiative, but to put everything that we have accumulated as the acquis of the OECD on education, on health, on taxes, on research and development, on universities, what have you, behind every one of our development initiatives. And therefore, when our development experts and our development technicians go to either Central Europe or Africa or Southeast Europe or Latin America or Asia or the Middle East, they can offer the totality of the installed capacity and the expertise and the skills that the OECD has accumulated over 50 years. So this is the big change. We're not mainstreaming development into our work. It's the other way around. We're distributing everything else that we do in our development work. And therefore, when we work with our bosses here of the African Development Bank for this particular exercise, or when we work with the, very soon we will be going to Panama for the Inter-American Development Bank and the summit of Ibero-American countries. Okay, we're using everything that is behind the OECD in order to put it on the table. This is one thing. Second, we of course are the home of the DAC. And the DAC is where aid comes out. And let me just say, by the way, we now like to say that, of course, this is not about aid, but please don't forget about aid. Because aid is actually falling in real terms. This is the bad news. For the first time in more than 20 years, we have a drop. Now, there are exemplary cases like the UK, that are keeping up their aid.
The drop
flows.
is coming from some specific countries?
Well, practically everybody else. No, I'm not being fair because there are a number of Nordic countries which are also keeping. But I have to say, countries that were committed for years and years, champions that are now having to cut because of tight budgets. I would say don't use a crisis as an excuse to reduce your aid flows. The crisis itself is making the needs more urgent and more important in developing countries. Now, we also have the African Partnership Forum. We also have the NEPAD OECD program. We have the MENA program. I could tell you, we have about 7 or 8 different instances in which we are working with Africa, but more importantly, we're working for Africa. Okay? Now, and I'll give you a very specific example about what you asked about taxes. First of all, in Accra, in Ghana, when we were having a meeting which was a predecessor of what we now call the Busan Initiative of development effectiveness. We changed aid effectiveness to development effectiveness, which I think is a mouthful. It explains a lot of what we're trying to do. We said the best way to spell aid is TAX. Okay? Now it has become a bit of a cliche. That means the mobilization of domestic resources is the place to start. Carlos Lopez just said people are not coming just to develop the to develop the export sector of manufacture of commodities, etc. There's a lot of work that is being done to exploit the wealth. Now, let me now very specifically say, on taxes, Africa has increased about 4 times the revenue, about 155 billion to about 514 billion. The problem is, of course, they can do a lot better, and there's a lot more to capture. On the natural resources sector just itself, remember how we were fighting for the investment. So, please come here, please come here. No, and the other guys say, oh, no, please come here to establish the car factory, to establish the plasma, whatever, the shoe factory. I will give you 5 years of tax-free. No, I will give you 10 years of tax-free. So 15 years of tax-free. And we were giving away the taxes as if it were, and therefore, no surprise, we're not collecting any taxes. And if you use the so-called base erosion and profit shifting on top of that, which is the ingenuity which legally the multinational companies are using in order to avoid taxation, plus the fact that individuals are squirreling their money outside, and there's an element of corruption in there. All these things together make clearly for a very, very heavy homework in terms of the agenda. But I also have to say that there's a lot of work that we're doing, that we're working with Africa and for Africa. We're working on the question of illegal flows. We're working also on the exchange of information, automatic exchange of information, the so-called base erosion and profit shifting so that the multinationals will pay taxes. Tax revenue statistics, Monsieur le Premier Ministre, je regrette de dire...
Mr. Prime Minister, I'm sorry to have to say this, but statistics always seem a little dry, not very sexy, to be honest. But if we cannot have accurate statistics in the field of taxation, then it's impossible to manage them properly. As to the question of how we can train mid-level managers and technicians and be in line with the needs of the country.
Case, we are having this initiative called Tax Inspectors Without Borders, so that we can have help the developing countries.
Are you working also on measuring the informal economy?
Yes, the problem, the informal economy, is so difficult to measure it because it's informal, but you were talking about 50%. In my country, maybe labor 60%, India 90% is informal. It's a curse. It's a terrible, terrible curse. We have to fight it, and we have to create the incentives. It's about economic rationality. Yeah. We have to create the incentives. The African Tax Administration Forum, for example, with the governments of Africa, with the African Development Bank. This is in South Africa. We're also fighting the criminal part, the Oslo Dialogue on Tax and Crime, etc. So, a number of areas where we are fighting tax evasion, tax fraud, also, but forming the base, the legal, the codifying, regulating, and on which we can then collect the taxes, and that this can be a normal way of life rather than exceptional. We now, really, there's a grand gaspillage des ressources, en commençant par les taxes.
To be faced with all this waste.
Conversation is at least highlighting 3-4 questions for you. In this global context, what is the next 5-year strategy for the African Development Bank? First question. So how do you, what is your vision? Number 2, we see that to really develop, I would say, and to make some transformation on natural resources, we need a huge and great network of infrastructures. And I know that you have started an initiative called Africa 50, which highlight the fact that we need at least $50 billion per year to really build great infrastructure in Africa. I would love to hear from you where you are on that initiative. And last but not least, how do you see the other, I would say, foreign direct investment coming in Africa from China, from America, and even from your colleagues from the different Exim banks, I would say?
Thank you, Richard. Can I first of all comment on what Angel just said? We have in the African Development Bank a soft window for financing low-income countries. And this is replenished every 3 years by the donors. 10 years ago, we were raising about $3 billion. In 2007, just before the crisis, I raised $7 billion. This time round, believe me, it was a struggle to raise the same $7 billion. Because I've lost some European countries who are not long able to contribute. Yeah. Luckily, though, talk about African natural resources. 4 African countries have actually come along to contribute to the fund: Angola, South Africa, Egypt, and Libya. Yeah. We lost Portugal, we lost Spain, but African countries have come along. And these are natural resource-rich countries. I really want to encourage that particular movement where there's a transfer of resources within Africa itself, and we're working on other natural resource-rich countries as well. Number 2, you asked me what is important 5 years going forward. I'm ending my term, so I'm not campaigning for another.
This is why you will be very objective.
You'll have to ask the new president of the bank. But where I stand, having been in the bank for 8 years now, I really see 3 things. The first one, we have to work on inclusion, 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 inclusion. Because if we don't, the risk of sustainability is very, very high. We're all here celebrating the achievements. They're limited. But what could stop it right in its track is large sections